Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. at the conclusion of a fascinating discussion called A Difficult Road, Stabilizing Iraq and the Gulf Region. And we're honored to have with us the Chairman Emeritus of the Stimson Center, Ambassador Link Bloomfield, who was the former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, who served in the George W. Bush administration in that capacity, the George H.W. Bush administration, and as a young pup in the Reagan administration as well. And a shout out that Trends Analysis was your partner on this, the UAE, Dubai-based think tank. Link, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Vago. It's a pleasure.
The event that you guys just had was The Difficult Road, Stabilizing Iraq and the Gulf Region. You made some fascinating comments, but what were the key takeaways from your standpoint of this discussion that included the Iraqi ambassador, but also a number of other folks?
Well, thanks, Vago. I think the most important things that happened today were two. One is to refocus Washington's conversation on Iraq. We've been exhausted by years of Iraq issues under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama. We have a new administration. It's a good time to sort of refocus and say, where are we and what does the future look like? What should we be talking about? The second thing is we co-hosted this with an Abu Dhabi think tank, the Trends Research Institute, who is a partner of ours, and they brought with them, I think, a regional perspective. How does Iraq look to the rest of the Gulf? Those are two kind of fresh themes. What I tried to do as a former government official, and you didn't mention my childhood in the two Reagan administrations in the Pentagon, that was where I came out, it was really to sort of look at Washington and say, how do our tools fit this look ahead at Iraq and the region? And if I could wave a magic wand, it would have to do with broadening the perspective of talented people in government, so they're not stuck in a sort of soda straw view of one country, one set of issues, managing one summit event or one phone call. We're very much of a transitory, transactional, small ball government at this point, except for the cabinet, who must do all the strategic thinking at the highest levels. They go and meet kings and prime ministers, and they come away thinking, we have a regional issue here. What are we going to do about it? We need to help them think through those regional issues. Some of them are military, some are paramilitary, but I think that for me the meta themes are states versus non-state power, religious pretension of authority versus borders and states that should run themselves, constitutional constructs that either protect the rights of minorities and that give people buy-in so they don't try to defend a local village against all comers, but instead belong to something larger and have a reason for doing so. Corruption, which I prefer to talk about more politely as a sort of transparency and governance issue. If we could come up with tools, including technology and metrics, to help governments track their money with two sets of eyes so that it doesn't slip away, that could be a tool that would help a lot of our foreign policies in the Middle East. Not to malign anyone, it's just the way culture is. So I think that there are things that can be done in the Middle East, but we need to recognize that the way we do business in Washington should also transform a little bit. And we need to figure out how to empower our friends in the region to sort of deliver concerted religious impacts that minimize the malign influence of Daesh or of the 1979 Iran Revolution, which is now supporting well over 150,000 troops under Iranian command in 9 countries, in 19 militias, by my count, and Palestinian areas. So these are strategic level problems. You heard Secretary Mattis talk about ballistic missiles being fired into Saudi Arabia from the Houthi areas of Yemen. Those are IRGC technicians who smuggled them in and fired them into Saudi Arabia. These problems will get much worse if we don't address them holistically.
Well, I want to go to the Iran question, but I want to go back to Iraq for a second. The president's focus was fighting ISIS. That was the singular focus. At first, it was very America First, and we don't need to engage in a lot of these other things. We had a constructive conversation with the ambassador of Iraq to the United States, who thinks that there is support for kind of a more long-range investment by the United States and other nations, as he made the case very eloquently about why Iraq's success is important to the region and important to the United States. Talk to us a little bit about whether, few people travel as extensively nor talk to as many senior people as you do. Do you see that support? Because the United States has had a tendency of supporting something until the very instant that it doesn't. Charlie Wilson famously said, like, we were willing to spend an enormous amount of money to beat the Soviets, but then we didn't want to do any of the investment to try to help the Afghans, and then where did that put us 20 years hence? In a very bad position. Is there support in the Congress, in the American political system, for the sustained kind of investment that will be necessary to stabilize Iraq, but also Afghanistan? I mean, another nation that faces a whole series of challenges. Some of them are serious, whether it's tribal and ethnic divisions.
I mean, the honest answer now is probably no, but the backup answer is that maybe there's a reason why we could be more supportive, but not by doing more of the same. I think what people understand is that whatever we've done fell short in Iraq. Whatever we've done, you just heard General Nicholson come and testify recently. The ANSF controls 52% of the country. 20% of the world's violent extremists are in Afghanistan. ISIS is in Afghanistan, as you saw with the explosion of the Moab. So I think what Congress would be looking for is show me something that's going to work. And that's the challenge, because I don't think that the tools and the ways of looking at these issues have entirely worked. I think part of the solution is to have better information, to really just listen to people who are over there, and they'll tell you things. There are resistance groups that are collecting detailed information that you'd never hear from U.S. embassies or from the podium at agencies. What President Trump did was to sort of address the issue that can come and strike in any town, in any school, in any mosque in America at any time, at any shopping mall, and usually it's someone sort of in sympathy with Daesh or ISIS. So of course that was the itch that needed to be scratched. But whether he knew it or not, and I think he did, by embracing essentially the Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia's visit, by sending General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, to the Middle East, he has made clear, without saying it, that the tilt to Tehran does not exist. It's over. And so that has already had a fairly strong effect of the Arab world saying, all right, America's back. Now how do we organize? And the way we organize is partially military. It's partially sanctions-based against bad actors, but it's beyond that. There are things we cannot do and we don't do well. They could do them well with our advice. Media, information gathering, religious positions that say, excuse me, we don't need to have a third supreme leader when this one is gone because we won't follow him. And by the way, they don't. If you're not on the payroll of Iran, even as like Hezbollah is entirely on Iran's payroll, so they are subservient. You know, Sistani of Iraq does not follow Twelver Shiism as it's practiced by Ali Khamenei. So I think that transition from the elder Ayatollahs, either pro and con, is a huge issue in the Middle East. I raised it today in Washington because I don't think I hear anyone else talking about it.
That was actually an interesting point because Ayatollah Ali Sistani is no spring chicken. He's 87 years old. But the message is that he is not a person, but he's a movement. He's a school of thought. And I want to get to that in a moment, but let's talk about Iran. The last administration was driving toward a nuclear deal with Iran. That was the focus of it. There was some suggestion. Jay Solomon, the senior diplomatic correspondent for Wall Street Journal, author of a great book on the relationship between Iran and the complex relationship between Iran and the United States. But one of the points that he made was, you know, his sort of sense that the administration was not getting involved in places in part because it put the Iran deal as a higher sort of strategic priority. First, your thoughts on the Iran deal, but second, what's the kind of relationship the United States can have with Iran, should have with Iran, given that A, its fingers, as King Abdullah has said, you know, the Shia crescent exists and exists within all of us and is a strategic threat. On the other hand, the Iranians have been exceptionally good at playing their hand. What's next for the Iran deal? Now that the Trump administration is now linking it, yesterday the tweet by the president, or the comment or statement by the president that, well, we're going to have to relook at this deal because we don't like Iran's terrorist affiliations. That wasn't part of the deal originally.
It's a great question. I was at a private dinner last night of policy analysts, and all they talked about was the JCPOA, and they're mostly nuclear experts. and anything that had to do with other issues was seen as an immediate threat to the good work that was done by the nuclear negotiators. There were two things I think that irritated parts of Washington about the JCPOA. One was the actual terms, which while they closed off short-term pathways to the bomb, they essentially legalized Iran's eventual pathway to being a nuclear power, should they so choose, a nuclear weapons power. There was nothing stopping them from that. But secondly, the way they dealt with Congress. They were cut out of the loop in the beginning. Their hand was forced, so they had this 30-day, 60-day deal where they had to bring it to Congress, and Congress had their staff made clear throughout that period that they weren't aware of what was going on, so they were piling up potential sanctions bills just as a bargaining chip with their own administration. As an American, I view Congress as the home team as well as the administration, no matter who is in the White House. And when you're dealing with a power like Iran, we need to have a lot more interplay and collusion between two branches of government on something like that. That's why I started writing about Iran in 2011, because I thought that Iran was doing what Russia is now accused of doing, which is massively providing disinformation and propaganda and essentially a smokescreen and agents of influence, to be perfectly honest. It's the same thing that I testified about on Russia recently with Ed Royce's committee, the HVAC. So I think we need a counterintelligence. We need to clean the decks a little bit and be clear. Look, I would engage Iran. If I were in the government, I would be polite. I would meet with them. I would hear them out. I would make suggestions. But I would do it on the basis of much more information. So in other words, the people of Iran don't know how much money the regime is spending. They don't realize how many troops are sort of dying in Syria. They don't have any idea how much money the Supreme Leader and the IRGC control in their 14 economic powerhouse foundations. That's why they can't do business with Americans, because so little of the economy is not sort of controlled by these mega organizations. And I don't think Washington understands that. So I think that if we were to do the same thing with Russia, which is expose their dirty little secrets, let's be clear on what's happening. Let's be clear on what they're doing. They're undermining state actors. They are promoting non-state actors. They're pushing sectarianism. Let's take the fight in Iraq to drive out ISIS. I've been receiving communications from the Sunni tribes and from journalists in the Sunni area of Iraq for months, and I've shared them with members of Congress, videos where they're not just fighting ISIS. They're actually committing what some would charge would be ethnic cleansing in places like Ramadi and Mosul, where the Sunni males are disappearing and can't be found. And so they're engaging in widespread sectarian warfare. I've spoken with the Saudis recently in Riyadh. What I heard was that at a funeral in the Eastern Province, which is Shia Saudi, there were demonstrations that were provoked by Iran to try to aggravate sectarian tensions at a time when the Saudi royal family is bringing more Shia into the government positions and really proud of the non-sectarian spirit that they're promoting inside the kingdom. Now, I can't judge these things, but I know who's on our side. We really need to stick with the state actors. We need to be clear that we're not against the Persian people in any way, shape, or form, but we see that they are victimized by a regime which is sort of sucking the lifeblood and the legitimacy. They're serially violating every law there is. You know, they're executing 3 people a day since Rouhani took office, 87 in January alone. And they say, well, these are drug traffickers and whatnot. The IRGC was caught in Germany with 2 semis in January when I was there, carrying 150 kilos of heroin, the IRGC. So they're huge global smugglers of illicit cargoes. It just goes on. And I think we need to get our facts in front of us, then let's have a conversation.
Iran has had the resources, but it also has had a strategy to disrupt and to take advantage of every Sunni population that exists throughout the Middle East to try to destabilize all of its Sunni adversaries as it sees it. You know, you mentioned the targeted killings that are happening. That's for a specific aim to get the Sunni population to be inflamed once again, as we saw during the Iraq War. And the way that we resolved that was to try to broker all sorts of pacts and also to a degree to buy off the Iranians to give us some strategic breathing room there. How important is Sistani and Sistani's successor in whatever happens in Iraq? Because one of the points that the Ambassador Yassin made, was that Sistani really is a great man who is at base a committed Iraqi and is looking forward for what's best for Iraq. What happens after Ali Sistani dies?
That's the big question that you hear about in the Gulf. What happens after Sistani dies? That's why Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir traveled to Iraq from Saudi Arabia for the first time. A foreign minister has gone in 27 years. That's why. Because they're concerned that after Sistani goes, there will not be a voice of immense religious stature to protect Iraq from being overrun by religious pilgrims who, among them, would be people who would take over the holy shrines of Najaf and Karbala, essentially over time, would buy people off, eventually take over the economies surrounding those, which is how they support themselves inside Iran, and would then have a claim to some of the holiest sites of Islam, more than any inside Iran. This is about the legitimacy and the sustainment of the 1979 revolution. What people don't seem to understand in Washington is that it wasn't the 1979 revolution and the Khomeini coming in as a conquering hero from Paris that establishes legitimacy, although it somewhat did. Within a year and a half, Iranians were at the polls and campaigning for office and were systematically denied that. Even Bani Sadr, who was elected with almost 100% participation of those who were allowed to run for office, he was the only legitimate president they've ever had. He was impeached because they kept allowing people to have political rallies and run for office and call for free speech. And finally, Khomeini had built up his religious institutions and the Basij enough that they finally took to the streets and shut it all down. On June 21, 1981. They almost lost the street again in 1999. Read The Economist, Iran's second revolution. They almost lost the street at the time of the flawed election of Ahmadinejad in 2009. And that December was when they went after all the people that they thought had tried to subvert them. And they again, I'm told, almost lost control of the streets of Iran in December of 2009. When the Arab Spring reached Daraa in Syria, that was the moment that the Iranians sprang to action, because they knew that if a constitutional republic like Tunisia were to arise in Syria, a transition under UN brokered auspices, and if the experiment that the American troops died for in Iraq, a constitutional republic that respects all of the Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, and all the minority communities, if those kinds of models spring up in these places, it would hit Iran next. So everything you've seen can be looked at through the lens of a regime that is sort of whistling past the graveyard and engaged in sort of revolutionary show of force, not because they want to kill Sunnis, but because they want to prove to their own people that they should still control all the money, all the guns, all the media, all the Justice Department. In other words, that they should have absolute and supreme power. Sistani is going to pass from the scene. Khamenei is going to pass from the scene. If nothing is done and a charismatic third supreme leader takes office and we don't do anything to, quote, push back, you'll have 25 more years of this. And so that's the strategic issue.
You mentioned Ahmadinejad. There are going to be Iranian elections. Ahmadinejad wants to stand again. How do you see the Iranian political dynamic? Because Iranian friends of mine were very optimistic with the Iran nuclear deal, this sort of sense that Iran would be normalized, that they could be proud to be able to say that they're Iranians, whether they were in the diaspora community, or whether they live in Iran. I've gotten the same message from them. What's the new blood in this election that could conceivably change the dynamic?
I think we have to be careful here. I don't regret the fact that we made a gesture toward Iran and that we reached out to the Iranian people and told them that you're not our enemy. That's very important, and we should keep saying that. The JCPOA, put the president in a box. President Trump and his co-candidates in the Republican primary were talking tough about the JCPOA, but if you go back to the first primary, candidate Trump said it's a contract. It's the first thing he said. And frankly, he understands now that if he tears up an executive agreement with a foreign country, he loses the ability to write executive agreements with foreign countries. That's his currency that we're talking about. So we have the agreement. It is what it is. It's done. He's not tearing it up. He's putting on notice whether it's being adhered to. That's the way he is. Let's show me that you're adhering to the deal. That's pressure. But we've moved on. We're post-JCPOA. And the question, I heard a very senior official at a think tank the other night listen to all the talk about the destabilization of the region and the executions inside Iran. And his comment, somewhat off color, was, I thought that with the nuclear agreement, we gave Iran a pass on all that stuff. Now, I've heard people talk about this, and the Iranians may think, the Iranian government may think, that we are committed not to not to push them at all, or push back, or that any of that would be a violation of the agreement. The question I have for U.S. negotiators is, what did you say at the negotiating table? Did we commit not to care if they're calling in airstrikes on Aleppo while little kids are being pulled from the rubble? Is that part of the nuclear deal? We need an explicit answer to that. So when you get to the elections, take a look at how many people ran for office, filed for the presidency, and then look at how many were allowed on the ballot. It's less than 4% since 1981. It's less than 2% over more than 2 decades. So the two principal people, Rouhani and Raisi, who have filed, both have said in recent days publicly in Iran that they went to the Supreme Leader and said, is it okay if I run for the president? And the Supreme Leader gave them the blessing. So he's handpicking his successors. The point is that the Basij, which are sort of low-level ground troops, if you will, for the Supreme Leader, that do a vetting that would make the Republicans and Democrats blush. Your loyalty is tested to the absolute utmost before you're allowed to run for president of Iran. So Rouhani was handpicked. They even said they would engineer the election in January of 2013. They'll do it again this year.
But is there a Rafsanjani-like figure who can stand up and be critical and challenge the Supreme Leader, or be able to challenge a future Supreme Leader?
Look, the Iranian people are very political. They're very smart. They like to mix it up. So that's the culture you see. But every one of those people in any position of authority, every one of them is on the same boat sailing down the river called, Veliat Ifaki. Not one of them would ever, do anything to put at risk the revolution in the place of the 79 million people who have hit the streets repeatedly over time. And so as you've seen, economic duress, the rial has weakened, inflation, oil prices. The nuclear deal was meant to give them a psychological boost. Today at the Stimson Center, I tried to explain how much money they're spending daily to sustain a payroll of probably 160 or 70,000 armed men all over the Middle East, outside their country. That's a daily payroll. Ask yourself why that's not going to the teachers in Tehran and to the pensioners who've been protesting of late and people living in graveyards outside the city.
Let me take you to what happens or should happen in Syria. There is no divorcing, even though the ambassador said, look, we think the ISIS fight is going to conclude very, very soon. We feel that, he felt that there would be an relatively easy reintegration of those fighters back into Iraqi society. There are some who disagree with that. They think that it's going to be somewhat more complicated. If you have a view on that, I'd love to hear it. But what should the U.S. approach to Syria been? The president has made some policy reversals, did fire some cruise missiles. There was advance warning, so it doesn't look like the damage was necessarily that significant from that. Talk to us a little bit about what the strategic U.S. view of the Syria crisis needs to be.
Well, it starts with the larger sort of strategic equity that the United States and the West, if you will, and Japan, sort of Korea, all of the advanced industrial countries live in a world where states who govern themselves transparently, who protect the rights of all their citizens, who do not put a potentate in charge with unlimited power, that model is the one that takes us to a better future. To the extent that others tear that down and are allowed to create autocratic systems, corrupt systems, violent systems, systems where people are at risk and in danger, that's a world that is much worse that we're leaving the world worse than we kept it. So we need to sort of look strategically at Syria. Some people think that it'll never be put back together. It certainly won't under Bashar al-Assad. The Arab League called for him to face war crimes prosecution years ago. Our State Department defunded the Syria war crimes account at the same time. It was not a good moment in U.S. diplomacy, but clearly the White House didn't want to get involved. So here we are, years later. It seems to me the Syrian High Negotiations Committee was in town recently. They have a program that they announced at the UNGA last September. It incorporates the rights of all citizens. I asked the head of the Negotiations Committee, Riyad al-Hijab, publicly to speak about what do you do with the Syrian regime if Bashar steps down. They've been running a very corrupt country. It's kind of a criminal ring. They run everything from telecom to the airlines, and they pocket the cash. But do all of them get put out of power? And do you destabilize the Alawite community, as we sort of did by firing the Iraqi army in 2003, if you recall, which is why many of them joined ISIS and will reintegrate afterwards. That's my answer to that question. The Iraqis will come back, and they shouldn't be unduly punished for being alienated from the Iraq that we left behind. In Syria, I still believe that the UN-brokered transition formula is the one that works. And I think if the president moves toward safe zones of any kind, we will have to defend them. We'll have to have a deconfliction understanding with Russia. They won't like it, but I don't think they'll test it. The Syrians will get shot if they come near us. The Iranians are going to have to be game over. They're on the ground. They're vulnerable. They're already an issue of how many people are dying in the Quds Force and the IRGC. The recruits are not backfilling them from Iran. People are not as enthusiastic about the revolution. So if they start actually suffering casualties with sophisticated military operations to defend safe zones and humanitarian corridors, this will turn up the heat on the Supreme Leader quite a bit. The formula is that Bashar has to go, the top number, pick a number, 30, 60, 100. Those people have to, and I think that if people know in the Syrian military that if they drop barrel bombs, they might be on the list for war crimes prosecution, but if they don't do it, if they defect, they won't. That was something I wrote 5 years ago. I still think that these kinds of tactics are relevant to the future now.
Where would you send Bashar and his cronies? Where is the safe haven for them?
I'm trying to remember what I wrote in the National Interest 5 years ago, a plan for Syria. No boots on the ground, no pilots in the air. That changed, that's evolved. There was a time when you could have sent him to any of a number of destinations and guaranteed that his flight would be safe and that he could take money with him, his friends, they would all be protected, but they could never re-enter politics. The sort of Charles Taylor Liberia solution when he went to Nigeria, and he did violate that. What can you say after what they did to Aleppo? What can you say after the Russians came in and bombed that humanitarian corridor all around sort of east of Damascus, from north to south, to try to kill the Syrian resistance and civilians? I don't know what to say, except that we have to have some accountability for crimes against humanity. And by the way, if we actually had perfect knowledge of the top 50 people in the Iranian regime, many of whom are in power, the justice minister under Rouhani today is guilty of crimes worse than Srebrenica and the Bataan Death March, according to British human rights lawyers. So there's accountability to be had, and that's part of the agenda that America should stand for. But we have to outline our principles. We have to know why state structures and protection of minorities is important. We have to urge our friends in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others that the Yemen outcome has to be just. We can't compromise these things. We have to be careful. But this is where our future lies. We have to know what side we're on, and we have to start acting like it.
Should Russians be on that list of war criminals as well at this point, given what they know and what they've done?
I would have to say for Syria, I would fall short of going that route with Russia. What I would do, though, as the former arms export authority of the United States, is to point out that long before they were allowed to bomb the 27th hospital east of Damascus, filled with doctors and people recovering from war wounds. Long before they got to that point, had it been us, we would have suspended all weapons. We would have absolutely pulled our units back. We would never engage in these kinds of crimes, and we would never have given the arms to Syria to allow them to drop barrel bombs from Russian helicopters, Russian munitions. I think Russia is going to spend the next 100 years essentially making amends to the Arab people for what they did.
You had one of the world's toughest jobs, not only in government, but we asked that. You had one of the world's toughest jobs when President Bush asked you to find all the loose man-portable air defense missiles around the world to keep them out of the hands of terrorists, and there was a massive global push. Your successors have focused on that, and there have been a couple of incidents that have happened worldwide, but not nearly as many as could have been had that incredibly difficult job not been engaged. It's a two-part question. Part one of the question is, there is constant talk about giving man-portable air defense missiles, obviously made the difference in the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets. Let's put these weapons in the hands of the Syrian opposition to be able to take down, whether they are Russian airplanes or to take down Syrian airplanes that are bombing civilians. Is that a step, if you were recommending and you were advising the president, would you tell him, let's give this capability to those Syrian resistance fighters?
Well, first of all, Vago, I would say that to the extent that we had success, there was a really strong team. There was effort from other agencies. There was great White House support from the counterterrorism team. So it was, to the extent we had success, it was a really great government effort. And I applaud people who put together task forces to address sensitive issues. We're lucky that we haven't had a civilian airliner go down in the world. It could happen at any time. If it does, I don't want to speculate because I know I've thought through all of the consequences, which would be dreadful. It would make life very unhappy for air travelers and for the State Department, and we'd be picking winners and losers. It would, and we'd be using military safeguard technology to protect civilians. So many things we wouldn't want to do. So we have to just hope that it doesn't happen. That's why in Syria, I wrote a plan for Syria 5 years ago and published it and said no man-pads. And I think I still stand by that position, even though every time the Syrian resistance comes to Washington, their number one request is for shoulder-fired missiles. And who can blame them? As you see, the white helmets in Syria and Idlib and Aleppo pulling these children from the rubble. It's just the most unacceptable, grotesque humanitarian horror. And so there have to be steps taken to stop it. President Trump is right about that. My view is that if we get to safe zones, I would trust the Turkish military, even though we have issues politically. They are a member of NATO. I would trust a NATO member with shoulder-fired missiles. I would trust U.S. forces with shoulder-fired missiles. I would not give them to non-state actors, even if they're on our side. I just think that all it takes is one, and it's not 9/11, but believe me, it's a huge Excedrin headache that we would not recover from for a long, long time, if ever. So we just have to stand on certain principles.
And from that effort, what are some of the lessons you learned that could be applicable, whether it's to a global cyber accord, because there were a number of nations worldwide that ended up participating in this endeavor, some nations which were adversary countries that you had to negotiate with. What are some of the lessons you learned that could be applicable to any crisis or any major control regime?
Well, in the case of my role as a special envoy, I did not want to be coming back again and again and again to places on the Horn of Africa or the Balkans or the Middle East, while others made demands to see if I could up the ante. I mean, I had a lot of authority, and I was able to reward people for helping us. But it had to be done, believe it or not, in one conversation. And so I would meet the leader of the country or someone right next to the leader or the chief of defense, and we would have to have a conversation where they learned to know me, to trust me, if I could get them to laugh a little bit, to get them on the same page, and then try to align what we wanted with their interests, all in one conversation. It worked in many instances, but that's the way I look at diplomacy in this case. Look, we just had a broad-ranging discussion about the Middle East and about Iraq and about Syria and Iran's role, and it seems to me that what's happened in Washington is we've become a little bit too stuck on the job that was right in front of us, on the in-basket, on how do I keep doing what I was doing already. We have military options, we have sanctions options, we can do things like that, but there's other things we haven't really thought of. We need to be really creative, and we need to bring information forward that changes the game, that points out what people don't want you to know about their situation and their activities. And I think that in the information age, that information is as powerful as high explosives. And that's certainly been proven true in the religious world of the Middle East. I think this is where America's, not that it can all be run from agencies of government here, but that's really where the imagination has to go. We need to align our interests with theirs by listening to them, by figuring out what direction is this going, and what would it take for it not to go in that direction? And the answer may not be addressed by simply condemning people, threatening them with military force, selling them arms, or sanctioning them. I mean, those are important tools, but there's much more to be done. And I think that, so I see some upside. We just need to be much more creative.
Ambassador Link Bloomfield, Chairman Emeritus of the Stimson Center and founder of Palmer Coats. Sir, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Vago. My great pleasure. Good to see you.
Let me ask one other parenthetic question that we're going to insert in, because you mentioned it, and then I'm going to catch shit for not following up. I know we were doing too well. She was like, yes, it's over. Briefly, it's about Turkey and Turkey's sort of future and its role. one of the things that we didn't talk about, but is the most important actor in the region, is really Turkey. And Turkey has had its own agenda. At least Recep Tayyip Erdogan has had his own agenda. He's been getting warmer toward the Russians, is committed over a fear that there could be an independent Kurdistan or a consolidated Kurdistan, obviously because of the Kurdish population in Turkey. Pressed ahead what some view as an unconstitutional maneuver for a power grab. There are even concerns that the coup was a self-staged coup in order to crack down on any manner of opposition to his rule. And I was talking to a senior NATO friend of mine who said, look, it's not even clear whether or not in a year, 2 or 5, that Turkey will even remain part of the NATO alliance, that it may find a whole bunch of reasons that strategic disruption could be very profitable for Turkey ultimately, as it sees the EU door sort of start to firmly close on it. What's Turkey's role in the region? How can America engage with a country that has shown a penchant for exercising its power in a very sort of classical sense? I have geography on my side. I have a large country that's economically prosperous. I sit at the crossroads, and I can do anything I want because ultimately 1,000 years of history has shown that I can do that.
As with many large powers in the world, there's nothing we should do or regret about their potential power, their geographic location, and the leverage they can exert from these things. What we do measure is the way they govern themselves. And so this last referendum, with a yes and a no, is troubling in a couple of respects. The number of academics that have been turned out of universities because somebody didn't like their views. The number of journalists who have been arrested, I think it's 150. That has to be troublesome. That's not a direction that we want to see our friends go. And Turkey is a friend, an ally, and a country that we've had huge respect for, have deep relations with. Like Egypt. We watch countries like this, I'm naming them because it's important for them to understand that at a certain point, you begin a conversation, not just whether they want to leave NATO, but let me start another conversation, because there are countries where, for the first time, we might start questioning, should country X stay in NATO? Should they be given the privilege of NATO if they drift too far into an autocratic and undemocratic and repressive mode, including control of the information space? Look, we've had a lot of chaos in Washington through the electoral season, and that's life. Would anyone trade that for a situation where academics, think tankers, journalists were all locked up because somebody didn't like their point of view? Can you imagine? Or where our constitutional system, we've just put another Supreme Court justice in, but the actual constitutional system were changed to consolidate power in one position. There's certain things that Americans can't advise Turkey on. I always thought that Kemal Ataturk was a heroic figure that made Turkey the great country that it is today. If they're moving in an anti-Kemalist, anti-secular direction, it's their business. But and look, I think we have to be sensitive on the question of the Kurdish Syrian Kurds and Turkey's sensitivities about that. The truth will lead us in the right direction. If we are actually helping the wrong people, that should be an issue for us, and they should bring it up with us. But this drift, to me, is very frustrating, and I think that what we need is better granularity, more listening, more back and forth. But there are certain things that are measured quite easily, and that is sort of freedom, basic freedoms that we consider to be inalienable rights. So when we see others denying them, that's a huge concern, and it could lead in directions that the Turkish people would find very onerous.
American presidents throughout history have made it a point that the United States is the shining example on a hill and should be the beacon for freedom and democracy, whether you were talking about some of the things that John Kennedy was saying or Ronald Reagan, the first president that you worked for, was passionate about always making the case that the United States will stand against evil and with democratic peoples. He became a hero to relatives of mine and through other people, folks who lived throughout the Soviet Empire, when he called it the evil empire. They would venerate their Reagan-Bush button as sort of a sign. And my cousin told me at that moment everybody was a fan of Reagan throughout the Soviet world. I mean, that's when the collapse sort of started, when we looked at our own system and said, wow, this guy really gets it. That's not to say that the United States has not dealt and done business with unsavory people, but it's been a recognition that they're somewhat perhaps less savory. There is a concern that some have that the president, while his message is changing and evolving, and that's welcomed by certainly establishment figures, there is this concern that he likes the strong man. There was a little bit of a falling out between the State Department and the White House when the president called Erdogan to congratulate him on the vote. State Department's role and view was much more muted. Al-Sisi came to the White House. He got a very warm reception. And yet Angela Merkel, the chancellor of a democratic Germany, got effectively an extremely cold shoulder while she was here. Does that affect the U.S. role, the U.S. voice, the U.S. ability to steer global events when folks look at disconnects, because folks watch that very, very carefully and perhaps telegraphs much more powerful messages than even what presidents say. It's what they do.
Look, our president is no stranger to media. I think anyone who watched the election last year sort of came away saying this was no accident. He knew something that all of us didn't know about sort of dominating the conversation in the airwaves. And so we're learning a lot from his aptitude for reaching out directly to his constituents. This administration is evolving. They've taken a number of steps, and I think no one would argue with the fact that General McMaster, Secretary Mattis, General Kelly, Rex Tillerson at the State Department, and the two intelligence chiefs represent a pretty highly credentialed and serious team who think geopolitically. So if the Trump administration does not articulate a national security strategy at some point that associates American power with the kind of world that so many people, including the former Soviet peoples, including people in Iran, can believe in and can hope for. If we don't do that, then it's a very much of a pragmatic day-to-day transactional life. And I don't sense that President Trump wants that. First of all, he's extended very warm hospitality to a number of visitors, Xi Jinping, Justin Trudeau, Abe of Japan at Mar-a-Lago. He does that very well. He prides himself on hospitality, but I think the whole point is that now that we're friends, including the Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and others, he is connecting. And so I think the next step is they need to say, all right, this is the kind of world that we want to avoid, and this is the kind of direction we should be moving. And who's with us? Not you're either with us or against us. It's not just terrorism. Terrorism is an effect, it's a result, it's a symptom. The real point is that there are authoritarian regimes who are learning to live in the internet age by squashing and controlling information, by using disinformation and propaganda, and the Russians have been caught doing this, but others do it too, and by controlling the means of production, economic means, transport, and all of the security state. Now that is a direction that could be very dangerous. It was dangerous at the height of the 20th century when communism and fascism hit their peak in the industrial age. I really think that the key point of national security strategy is to recognize how that could manifest itself in 10 to 20 years in the information age. And so we really need to stand for open, transparent, democratic governance. We can tolerate a lot of chaos. This republic will never fall. You know why? Because there's 320 million stakeholders, not one of whom will ever concede to a foreign power.
But wouldn't you argue that the president's statements, his criticism of the press, his manipulation of information, I've covered a lot of White Houses or administrations over the years. You've seen a lot. I think that they have certain credibility problems when it comes to fundamental understanding of the truth. Doesn't that all become potentially problematic and sort of antithetical to what you're arguing in some cases?
The way the American system works, you can stand there on camera as a journalist and say what you just said, and you'll be standing there tomorrow interviewing someone else. No problem. You will still see Saturday Night Live. The president won't enjoy it very much, and others in the White House, but it'll still air. They won't be in jail. And I think that's the American system. So you heard that one of the, InfoWars, because of a divorce court case, we've learned that the person behind the camera there who's told us all these things about 9/11 and Sandy Hook was actually a performance artist. So his word should not be taken seriously. I think that there is a process of rediscovery going on where we're saying, where can we find true facts? But we're not going to find them by having Pravda in Washington. We're going to find them by having you and so many others who are absolutely free to walk the streets and ask anything you want and challenge anyone you want and still continue about your business. I think that's a message that I would hope the president of Turkey will take to heart.
Link, thanks very much, and they should start with the think tankers. I'm not kidding. Thanks, Link.